In 1967, a 60-year-old man straddled a motorcycle built nearly half a century before. Out on the endless white of the Utah Salt Flats, he leans into the wind and chases a dream that most would have abandoned decades earlier. His machine is no polished factory racer. It began life as a humble 1920 Indian Scout, reshaped and rebuilt by his own hands in a small New Zealand shed. Yet here, against all odds, it is ready to defy the limits of speed. This is the legend behind the world's fastest Indian. This story begins in rural New Zealand at the turn of the 20th century, where Herbert James Burt Munro grew up with little more than open fields, a restless imagination, and a fascination for anything that moved fast. While other children were content with farm chores, Burt was the boy who would stare at the wheels of passing carts and wanted to know how things worked. From those early years, speed was an unavoidable thrill and a calling for him. As he grew older, that calling turned into a way of life. He had no formal training as a mechanic, but his shed became a laboratory of invention. He was frugal to the bone, but always kept reusing scraps of metal, filing and grinding them until they became the pieces he needed. Burt was known locally not only as a racer on the beaches near Invercargill, but as a man who could build what he couldn't buy. He shaped pistons with his own hands, rethought the simplest parts, and believed that if something slowed him down, it could always be fixed. Neighbors would sometimes laugh at the noises of engines and metal coming from his shed, but they also knew Burt was different from them. He once molded parts from old tin cans, cast his own aluminum, and experimented with makeshift foundries just to get the perfect fit. It was his dedication that looked like madness until the results spoke for themselves. To many, he seemed strange, but to those who watched him race along Oreti Beach, there was no doubt that he was something rare. In 1920, Burt bought the motorcycle that would become his life's companion. It was an Indian Scout. Basically, it was an ordinary machine, modest in power and speed, but in Burt's eyes, it was his canvas. From that moment on, the bike and the man would grow old together, each transformed by the other in a partnership that would one day astonish the world. The Indian Scout that Burt brought home in 1920 was never meant to be a record breaker. Straight from the factory, it was a simple V-twin, just over 600 cubic centimeters, a solid and reliable road bike built for the average rider. Yet when Burt looked at it, he didn't see limits. He saw a foundation for something greater. Over the decades, he began reshaping the machine piece by piece. He pushed the engine beyond what its makers could have imagined, stroking it until its displacement grew close to 950 cubic centimeters. Nothing about the process was easy. He made pistons, barrels, flywheels, and even the cams by hand, grinding and molding until they worked. At times, he even experimented with overhead valve conversions, which was an audacious change that required imagination and daring more than formal engineering skill. Every modification was born from trial, error, and persistence. If something broke, he would rebuild it stronger. If something slowed him down, he would reinvent it. But the engine was only one part of the transformation. Burt understood that to conquer speed, he had to conquer air and traction as well. He built a long, cigar-shaped shell to slip through the wind, a streamliner that gave the humble Scout the look of a missile. For grip, he shaved down the tread on his tires, creating makeshift slicks when proper racing rubber was far out of reach. He adjusted gearing, played around with the clutch, and modified the oiling system so the bike could survive at full throttle for as long as the salt flats demanded. These changes gave the Scout remarkable power, but they also made it fragile. The engine could scream at extraordinary speeds, but it often demanded a rebuild after just a few runs. Burt accepted this fragility as the price of chasing the horizon. He would strip the machine down, repair it by hand, and ride again. Over time, the motorcycle ceased to be a factory product at all. It became something unique, half Indian, half Munro, and entirely a work of obsession. By the 1950s, Burt's Indian Scout was already unlike anything else on the planet, but New Zealand's beaches could no longer contain his ambitions. So he packed his tools and dreams into crates and set his sights on the ultimate proving ground, the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah. It was not an easy journey. Money was scarce, travel was exhausting, and Burt was far from the polished image of a professional racer. Yet year after year, he returned, often sleeping in makeshift shelters, cooking his meals on the salt, and working on the bike with nothing but the tools he had carried across the ocean. Bonneville was a place where limits were tested, and Burt fit right in as the humble outsider chasing something few believed possible. What made the Flats special was not just the speed, but the people. Fellow racers, timers, and crews welcomed him despite his ragged appearance and unconventional machine. They admired his determination and the fact that he could rebuild an engine with parts he'd shaped himself. The salt was no doubt harsh and unforgiving, but it was also a place of companionship, where competitors traded advice and celebrated each other's milestones. And Burt, with his easy smile and endless stories, quickly became part of that unique brotherhood. Slowly, the records began to come. Smaller class wins made others take notice of him, and each run brought him closer to the day when everything would finally align. By the mid-1960s, the man from Invercargill was no longer just a curious visitor. He was a fixture on the salt, and he was edging toward the ride that would etch his name into history. On August 26, 1967, the sun rose over the white expanse of Bonneville, casting long shadows across the salt. At 68 years old, Burt Munro wheeled out a motorcycle that had been built nearly half a century earlier. The Indian Scout, transformed beyond recognition, stood gleaming in its narrow streamliner shell. Around him, modern machines and professional crews prepared for their runs, but Burt had come with only his determination, his handmade parts, and the stubborn belief that this would be his day. The rules of Bonneville were simple but unforgiving. Speed was measured not by a single dash, but by the average of 2 runs in opposite directions. Engines had to hold together, riders had to stay sharp, and luck had to be on their side. When Burt twisted the throttle, the Scout roared to life, with the fragile engine screaming at the edge of its endurance. Across the salt he flew, tucked low in the shell, fighting both drag and the doubt of those who had underestimated him. One way, then back the other. When the timers calculated the results, the numbers spoke louder than any words, an official average of 183.59 miles per hour. Some witnesses swore his one-way speed was even higher, brushing past 190 miles per hour, but the record that mattered was now etched in the books. But it hadn't come without risk. The engine was pushed right to its absolute limit, and the bike needed care between runs, patched up and coaxed to keep moving. But it held together, just as Burt himself had held on through decades of preparation. When the announcement came, the Salt Flats erupted. Racers and crews who had watched the quiet man from New Zealand work tirelessly for years now applauded as he became the world record holder for the under 1,000cc class. For Burt, it was not about fame or glory. It was proof that persistence could triumph over circumstance, that a homemade machine and a lifetime of obsession could achieve the impossible. The official record was his, and with it, a place among legends. Before we continue, every racer needs a pit crew. Hit subscribe and join mine for more stories of legends who defy the odds. Ready, go! When Burt Munro returned home after his record, he wasn't greeted with parades or headlines splashed across the world's newspapers. But within the motorcycle community, his achievement resonated deeply. Here was a man with no factory sponsorship, no professional team, no cutting-edge equipment, and yet he had done what few thought possible. Among riders and racers, his name became a quiet legend, passed on in workshops, racing pits, and motorcycle clubs. Over time, that legend grew into something more permanent, The Indian Scout he had reshaped into a missile of speed was preserved, eventually finding its place in museums where people could stand before it and marvel at the handmade details. His workshop, his tools, even his improvised molds and castings became artifacts and reminders of a man who made extraordinary things with the most ordinary means. Today, visitors to Invercargill can see these relics up close, a time capsule of obsession and ingenuity. Beyond the tools and the bike, Burt's legacy shaped motorcycle culture itself. He became a symbol for the gentleman race, a man who raced for love of the challenge. Kusk builder, vintage racers, and even modern engineers point to Munro as proof that raw ingenuity can outpace resources. His story also boosted Indian motorcycles' cult status, turning an almost forgotten scout model into a piece of living mythology. But perhaps the greatest part of Burt's legacy isn't just mechanical, it's cultural. He came to embody the spirit of the self-taught builder, the backyard racer, who pursues a dream not for glory, but for the sheer joy of testing limits. His story has been embraced by dreamers, achievers, and anyone who understands the beauty of persistence. And Burt's record is proof that determination can turn a shed-built motorcycle into a world-class machine. His legacy is simply an invitation to come and chase the impossible. Almost 40 years after Burt's record-breaking run at Bonneville, his story returned in a new form. This time, not on the salt, but on the silver screen. In 2005, director Roger Donaldson released The World's Fastest Indian, with Academy Award winner Anthony Hopkins portraying Burt Munro. For millions around the globe, the film was their first introduction to the strange New Zealander who had defied the odds with his battered Indian Scout. What made the movie stand out was not its strict adherence to history, but the way it captured Burt's essence. Hopkins played him as he truly was, inventive, stubborn, and endlessly optimistic. Audiences just loved the performance. They were drawn towards the warmth, humor, and determination that defined Burt's character. The film showed his long journey to America, his encounters with strangers along the way, and the heart-stopping moment when he finally unleashed the Indian on the salt. Of course, Hollywood took liberties. Decades of preparation and repeated trips to Bonneville were condensed into a single adventure. Timelines were tightened and characters got simplified. Yet rather than diminish the story, these changes made it more accessible, transforming Burt's struggle into a cinematic folktale of grit and passion. The impact was commendable. The movie reignited worldwide interest in Burt's achievements, sending visitors to his hometown of Invercargill and to the museums where his workshop and beloved Indian are preserved. So, what do you take from Burt's journey? Maybe it's time to dust off that project in your garage, or chase a dream others call impossible. And which extreme record should we cover next? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, hit subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss the next legend of speed. Thanks for watching, and keep chasing your own impossible.